Hello everyone, so today we'll be talking about the menstrual cycle. Here are my resources. I've learned quite a lot from Osmosis and Zero to Finals. They both have really nice videos explaining the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle, you can look at it in two perspectives. From the perspective of the ovum, you have the follicular phase and the luteal phase. Follicular phase um, corresponds to when the ovary or when the ovums are still located in your follicles. So you have your primary follicle, secondary follicle, Graafian follicle. These all correspond to the follicular phase. Whereas the luteal phase corresponds to your corpus luteum, which is once your ovulation occurs, your ovum comes out from the follicles, and then what's left of your follicles becomes the corpus luteum, and hence it's called the luteal phase. From the perspective of the endometrium or from the uterus, you have the menstrual phase, which is when the bleeding occurs, the proliferative phase, which is when your endometrium thickens, and the secretory phase, which is when your endometrial lining is maintained and your cervical mucus thickens. Now, when we are talking about follicular phase, we're actually talking about the menstrual phase and the proliferative phase. These two phases occur together, whereas the luteal phase occurs with the secretory phase. So when it's quite interchangeable when we're talking about secretory phase, it's the same as luteal phase and vice versa. This is a diagram I got from Wikipedia. It shows very nicely how the two perspectives overlap. So down here you can see in the perspective of the endometrium, you have the menses, menstrual phase, you have the proliferative phase, and you have the secretory phase. Whereas up here you can see in the perspective of the ovum, you have the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So you can see which phases correspond to which phases. So before we do anything, we need to understand how the hormones in our hypothalamus, pituitary, gonadal axis work. So your hypothalamus secretes GnRH. GnRH stimulates the pituitary to secrete your gonadotropins, which are your FSH and LH. So FSH, short for follicle stimulating hormone, stimulates your follicles to grow. And the net effect is that your follicles will produce more estradiol, which is the same as estrogen. Estrogen is responsible for your secondary sex characteristics such as breast enlargement, um, maturity of the sexual organs, and also in the process of menstruation, it is important for the proliferation or the thickening of your endometrium. So this estrogen will have a negative feedback on your hypothalamus and pituitary to reduce the secretion of FSH and LH. And when this FSH and LH reduces, usually about 15 follicles will start and grow. However, when this FSH and LH is low, only one follicle survives, and that will become the dominant follicle. And the dominant follicle will continue to grow. As the dominant follicle continues to grow, the follicle will produce more estrogen, and then until the estrogen reaches a peak, the negative feedback to the pituitary suddenly becomes a positive feedback. So at first, estrogen suppresses your FSH and LH, but then suddenly when estrogen reaches a certain level, it increases the FSH and LH instead, causing a FSH and LH surge. And this surge, LH surge, causes the ovulation, where your ovum comes out from your follicles, and then um, uh, your ovum will be ready to be fertilized in the fallopian tube, whereas what's left of your follicles become the corpus luteum. This is the transition between the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So once you go into the luteal phase, this corpus luteum will continue to secrete two hormones, which is your estrogen and progesterone. However, take note that progesterone is a dominant hormone in this phase. Estrogen is not so much dominant in this phase. So progesterone as the main hormone, same thing, progesterone causes negative feedback to your hypothalamus, etc. And the effect of progesterone in your menstrual cycle is to thicken the not thicken, to maintain your endometrium, and also to thicken the mucus of your cervix, your cervical mucus, so that nothing gets inside the uterus during this phase. Right. So let's look at the phases in the perspective of the endometrium. So days 1 to 5 is your menstrual phase, where you have shedding of the endometrium and contraction of the myometrium. This is where you get your period pains, because the muscles here are contracting to expulse all your shedding endometrial lining. After that, you have the proliferative phase. Remember that in the proliferative phase, your main hormone secreted by the follicles is your estrogen, and the effect of estrogen in your menstrual cycle is to thicken the endometrium. So days 5 to 13, your proliferative phase, your endometrium thickens. And then after that comes the secretory phase, which is the same as your luteal phase, where your corpus luteum, the main hormone that it produces is your progesterone. And the effect of progesterone on your endometrial lining is to maintain the endometrial lining and thicken the cervical mucus. So over here you have some cervical mucus, which becomes thick in this phase, so that foreign materials don't get in. It's like preparing your endometrium, your uterus environment, preparing it for the growth of the baby if the egg gets fertilized. So you don't want anything coming in from outside, and you want the endometrial lining to maintain being thick. And then after that, remember after your corpus luteum, you have corpus albicans. If your corpus luteum, if your egg is not fertilized, and then your corpus luteum will regress into the corpus albicans, where no estrogen or progesterone is produced anymore. And once progesterone drops, right, the maintenance of your uterine lining disappears, and hence your endometrial lining breaks down and starts to shed, and that's when you go back to your menstrual phase. Yeah, I think that's all I have for you. Hope it helps. Thanks for watching.